Hello and welcome to Revision Tips for SIPS Level 5 Advanced Diploma in Procurement and Supply. This is Module 5, which is Managing Ethical Procurement and Supply, and it's Learning Outcome 1, which is to be able to understand and analyse the impact of ethics and sustainability in our supply chains. So we're going to look at those implications and contrast the drivers for globalisation, differentiate between cultural and social issues, and contrast the potential conflicts that arise between the needs of our stakeholders. So ethics, let's look at some definitions of sustainability. We've got ethics, sustainability, and responsible procurement. Now, ethics is, in business, it's about the study of the controversial issues, including matters such as inside trading, bribery, and discrimination. Inside trading is traded on the stock exchange by people who have got access to information that's not available to the public. And that could be about a company or who therefore have an advantage over other traders. So ethics in general is your moral principles that govern a person's behaviour or an organisation's. Now, sustainability is the ability to continue indefinitely, whether that be profit from a planet perspective or from a people perspective. And that means developing a stable relationship between human activities and the natural world. In business, this means managing the triple bottom line, people, planet, profit, which comprises of financial, social and environmental risks, as well as obligations and opportunities. And then responsible procurement is just the process by which the environment, social and ethical impacts of a purchase are considered. So here you can see the triple bottom line. It's an accounting framework and it works in three parts. As I say, financial, social and environmental, but it's otherwise known as people, planet, profit, or the three Ps. And the goal is to achieve a balance between these three things rather than just focusing on the bottom line being profit only. Now, what you can see on the screen is the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals that are going to transform our world. And sustainable development protects the world's resources without leaving generations with fewer natural resources that they can enjoy. So these goals are a plan of action adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 2015 for people, the planet and prosperity towards 2030. These goals are a universal call to all businesses to end poverty, protect the planet and ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity. And the Sustainable Development Goals have actionable targets which will focus on the efforts of stakeholders, and they'll apply to both developing and developed countries. So firstly, we've got no poverty. Secondly, zero hunger, good health, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, renewable energy, good jobs and economic growth, innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption, climate action, life below water, life on land, peace and justice, and strong institutions, as well as partnership for the goals. So what a lot of organisations will do is put together a corporate social responsibility policy, and that is a business approach that contributes to sustainable development by delivering economic, social and environmental benefits to all its stakeholders. Some companies pay lip service to this, and that's to say that they'll agree to do something but not really do anything actively to support it. They conclude that it's only worth spending and supporting as long as it increases profits, or if it doesn't harm the profits. And those sorts of things will include satisfying their stakeholders to secure funding for the future. But the companies separate their business principles from their moral principles. And these companies are failing to recognise the benefits of CSR because they're too busy giving lip service to it when they should be trying to communicate and understand their stakeholders so they can move on with their relationships. This can only be achieved by listening to the logical argument and learning from the marketplace. Where this fails, some governments have forced CSRs onto companies by introducing laws regarding moral behaviours of businesses. But there are benefits, increased profit, satisfied stakeholders and better business morales, and it's going to help try to retain your workforce. But the resistance comes from senior managers who feel forced to comply with these things. Employees worry that their job will change and decision making will need restructuring. Now, in the UK, there are already regulations that are relevant to CSR, some of which you can see listed on the screen. But no matter whether a company views CSR positively or negatively, it must comply with these laws. So you've got things like the Working Time Regulations, the Race Relations Act, disability discrimination, maternity and paternity leave, Employment Act, Health and Safety at Work, the Companies Act, and Account Modernisation Directive. All of these things are a mandatory compliance. But the factors that drive companies to pursue CSR are fairly consistent across the corporate world. They want to create a more sustainable supply chain. They want to make the organisation more resilient in the face of environmental challenges, as well as increasing brand recognition and the ability to retain and attract new staff. Improving their reputation, which will increase the sales and customer loyalty, and growing the organisation by addressing stakeholder concerns about business sustainability. Now, once a company makes a decision to adopt a CSR activity, a plan must be drawn up and implemented. To be effective, all internal and external stakeholders should be engaged in the process. This includes employees, managers, suppliers, and any non-government organisations. Now, the Institute of Sustainable Development outlines what it considers to be the 6 key components within a CSR plan. You need the assessment, followed by a strategy, then commitment from the stakeholders, considering to be the most important one. You need a top-down approach, senior level buy-in. Implementation plan and activities, a verification and evaluation of the results, and then you go back and refine because there's always room for improvement. Responsible procurement involves choosing products and services that have a negative effect on society, as well as the environment and people's health. And one of the principles behind responsible procurement is the life cycle costing. This is a technique that's used to establish the total cost of products or services from the moment it starts to be produced to the point at which it's finished or discarded. And here are some questions to ask when undertaking life cycle costing. Is the purchase necessary? What are they made of? Under what conditions have they been made? How far have they travelled? What are the components of the packaging? How will they be used and then disposed of? Now, the benefits of responsible procurement can vary depending on the organisation and the industry sector, but these are some of the benefits that you might see. Cost savings, because if you're using life cycle costing, you will discover that a product that is initially more expensive than the others may actually be more cost effective when you consider all the other associated costs. Enhancing your business reputation and social improvements. So customer loyalty increases and businesses attract new customers, and would conversely cause reputational damage if a company was associated with a supplier who doesn't consider the environmental, social, or ethical impacts of their actions. Increased access to funding, such as those from investors and lenders, as they're likely to be around in the long run. Attracting government incentives. Buyers should research the incentives in their country. In the UK, the Enhanced Capital Allowance Scheme allows businesses to claim tax breaks on investments in energy-efficient equipment, such as heating, lighting, and refrigeration systems. And then promoting innovation. As more and more customers demand sustainable improvements, businesses can encourage their suppliers to make their manufacturing processes and products more environmentally friendly. And then finally, retaining and attracting staff. This shows a commitment to long-term environmental and social issues, which helps to attract and retain employees. Now, sustainable procurement does allow you to meet the needs of the goods and services and utilities whilst generating benefits to your organisation, to the society and the economy, as well as minimising damage to the environment. And all businesses need to adopt sustainable practices. Businesses that do find that it leads to better corporate culture, more reliable products and greater long-term profitability. And there are some risks and rewards of behaving sustainably. So the risks are that, you could lose your competitive advantage, increase spending on CSR activities, production costs, and public scrutiny on your behaviour, as well as loss of staff and customers with skills and expertise, or customers and investors. But the rewards could be an improved brand image and competitive advantage, increased productivity and reduction of waste, the ability to comply with the regulations and legislation, a reduction in risk, and increased attractiveness to potential employees and investors, which ultimately lead to satisfied stakeholders. So if organisations fail to address sustainability within their business, they risk losing all of those profits and customers. And failing to behave sustainably will have long-term impacts on society and the environment. Many large corporations now realise that sustainability risks, such as water scarcity and extreme weather, are also risks to their business and the prosperity. So it takes dedication, commitment and action to practice sustainability. In order to succeed, a business needs all of its employees to support it. There are the 9 practical steps that could be followed in order to develop a sustainable procurement policy. Each step in the process should be clear and must be communicated effectively to all those involved. So, identify the need, work out why companies want to be more sustainable, and then look at who will take lead responsibility. So the business must identify someone to take responsibility for encouraging employees to engage in sustainable practices. Gather the information such as legislation and consequences of non-conformance of air pollution or even carbon emissions. Then draft your policy, ensuring that the wording, complexity and language of the policy is appropriate. Consult with your stakeholders. Policies will be much more effective if stakeholders support it. Approve the policy, first by a responsible person or a committee, and then final approval by the board of directors. Procedures, such as how will the business communicate the policy? Will staff require training? Implement the policy by taking note of any part that needs improvement or monitoring closely. And finally, to monitor, the important step, because legislation and regulations change and evolve over time. Now, as sourcing has become more global, instances of exploitation and malpractice have come to light, raising questions about how ethical corners may be cut to produce goods cheaper. And when talking about ethics in supply chains, managers generally refer to producers, suppliers, manufacturers, and retailers and consumers. And they focus on freedom of employment and association, the eradication of child labour, safe and hygienic working, appropriate pay and working hours, humane and non-discriminatory treatment, anti-bribery, corruption, and environmental awareness. And in the past these 3 ingredients of an ethical supply chain were largely governed through the values of individual businesses and countries, but over recent decades, this has become codified in international law, regardless of traditional culture. Now, each business is ultimately responsible for ensuring that all parties within its supply chain are acting ethically. Organisations therefore need to do an audit of the practices throughout their supply chain to identify and address any unethical business practices that may be occurring. Now, some of the main issues around supply chains are things like equality, and that's ensuring that every individual has an equal opportunity to make their life and talents guaranteed. And it's guaranteed by the UK with the Equalities Act 2010. Modern slavery is being forced to work for little or no pay, made illegal in the UK by the Modern Slavery Act 2015. Bribery is, offering someone some money or a valuable gift to persuade them to do something that was made illegal in the UK by Bribery Act 2010. Same as corruption, which is dishonest behaviour of people in power, again, it's illegal in the UK under the Bribery Act 2010. Fraud is the criminal or wrongful deception which is intended to allow an individual to gain financially or personally, illegal in the UK under the Fraud Act 2006. And in human rights, the rights that every human being has, guaranteed in the UK by the Human Rights Act 1998. Now, there are several characteristics that are protected under the Equalities Act 2010. This includes age, disability, race, and sexual orientation. It's illegal to discriminate against anyone because of their protected characteristics. And you can see the others on the screen now. Some of the more recent ones are things like gender reassignment, pregnancy, but there should be no discrimination against any of these protected characteristics. Now, modern slavery can affect people of any age, gender, or race, but most commonly affects people and communities who are vulnerable. So some specific examples of modern slavery are outlined here. We've got forced labour, people who are forced to work against their will under threat of punishment. Debt bondage, people borrow money and they can't repay it, and they're required to work to pay the debt with very little control over the conditions of employment or debt repayment. Human trafficking is where people are transported from place to place in order to be exploited by physical violence or threats. Descendant-based slavery, people are born into slavery because their ancestors were slaves. Or even child slavery, children are exploited for someone else's gain, forcing them to become soldiers or work as domestic slaves or undergo forced marriage. Now, you may have remembered this from Level 5 Module 2 Risk, but here is a reminder of the types of bribes. Bribes are not always obvious and may come in the form of expensive gifts. Bribes can be more subtle, with neither party believing that they're doing anything wrong. But all the situations will be to secure a contract, gain knowledge, win an order, ignore poor performance, or get falsified documents. And essentially, the bribe is usually in the form of money or gifts. Now, corruption may affect businesses that don't seem to be engaging in corrupt activities. And as a procurement professional, you'll need to be assessing the impact of bribery and corruption on your supply chain. You should examine the whole supply chain to consider whether compliance procedures need to be adopted across the whole of the supply chain. So corruption is an illegitimate use of a person's role. This may include a range of different types of crime, including bribery, which is usually limited to giving or accepting payments, or other advantages such as gifts or preferential treatment. Organisations must have robust anti-corruption and anti-bribery policies. And then fraud. Fraud is a criminal deception that's designed to give a person or a business a financial or personal benefit. Fraud in a supply chain is a complex issue that procurement need to address to identify and remove any risks from their supply chain. And that's not an easy task, but procurement can use basic principles. And that is to have a diverse supply chain with many suppliers, and that can mitigate the risk. Be cautious about suppliers' offers. So sometimes if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Keep up to date with the legislation, because the consequences of fraud are increasing. And know who to deal with, or know who the business is dealing with. So monitor the suppliers using fact-finding questionnaires and research. Now, human rights are the rights and freedoms that all humans are considered to hold. They're considered to be standard of treatment of people around the world. But the infringement of human rights is widespread around the world, and it can be lucrative. And here we're going to look at some of the consequences of ignoring the abuse of human rights. Firstly, of course, the violation of law, and you can face sanctions and penalties or even imprisonment. Legal action, where workers take action against the business for the poor working conditions that maybe cause them an injury or an illness or even death. The interruption of your supply chain. Production can be shut down by local authorities, or unhappy employees can take action such as strikes. You have a conflict with your company values, so your actions can become into conflict with its mission and values, and it undermines the stakeholders' trust. Or brand reputation, such as media coverage, which can cause reputational damage and give you financial losses. And now we're going to look at the macro environment steeple analysis, or steepled. This one has a D on the end. So firstly, socio-cultural factors are customers, lifestyles, the values that characterize society and how they work. Technology has a huge impact on businesses as the world becomes more interconnected with systems and networks. And the economy will slowly affect every and all businesses, especially in time of boom or bust. The environment is a critical factor in today's world, demanding sustainable procurement and ethical practices. And political decisions will impact on procurement and supply, especially if politicians impose sanctions or make new trade agreements. Legal terms and regulations that are laid down by countries and authorities will govern how procurement and supply is undertaken. And the ethics or moral principles that govern a person's behaviour or the conducting of procurement. And finally, the demographics factor can include detail about the market and the customers, such as population, education, gender, age, marital status, and language. Now, globalisation is the process by which the world is becoming increasingly interconnected as a result of massively increased trade and cultural exchange. Globalisation has increased the production of goods and services. The biggest companies are no longer national but multinational corporations with subsidiaries in many countries. Globalisation can be a driver by the desire to increase profits, become competitive in other markets, or strengthen the market position by having a presence closer to the market products, or new markets to increase their life cycle, source operations in low-cost countries, or source services in low-cost countries. But the four main drivers for globalisation is the technological drivers, so transport innovations. Commercial jet aircrafts allow business to move products and people around the world. But information technology enables people anywhere in the world to communicate with one another very easily and cheaply. And the internet lowered the cost of communication, enabling the growth of the global e-commerce and stimulated global trade in products such as software, outsourced services, and media content. And then we've got the market drivers. Globalisation provides opportunity for growth in the global market. Operating in more than one country would enable businesses to increase their sales, profits, and value to shareholders. And the political drivers, less restrictive trading rules, making it easier for businesses to expand to new territories, and allow foreign direct investment in different countries around the world. Governments also offer to help domestic businesses to expand overseas because international expansion brings profit back to their national country. And finally, the cost drivers. Global companies can source materials, products, and labour more effectively and efficiently, but these costs can vary widely from one country to another. Large companies can buy quantities of materials from suppliers, enabling them to build global economies of scale, which usually results in reduced prices. There's a good side of globalisation. It's all about the efficiencies and opportunities to open market. And supply chains can communicate effectively and efficiently with their partners, suppliers, and customers, and manage their suppliers, inventories, and distribution networks are much, much better. But the bad side is that it's all about new risks and uncertainties that are brought about by the high degree of integration of domestic and local markets, intensification of competition, and the high degree of imitation. Price and profit swings and businesses actually lead to destruction of the business and the product. And then you've got the ugly side, where nations and local communities try to escape the vicious cycle of income and employment declines through simultaneously currency devaluations, and by raising trade barriers in the essence, it puts an end to globalization and a beginning to trade wars. Now, in the simplest terms, a competitive advantage is anything that a business does or has, and it puts it in a stronger position than its competitors. However, it must be difficult to duplicate. If it's easy to be copied or imitated, it's not considered a competitive advantage. But here are some of the examples. You've got people, if employees are better at doing key tasks, it's hard to copy that, but very easy to poach. The culture, if people within a business have shared beliefs and a common mission, and they're working together to achieve the results, that's hard to copy. As well as the processes, especially if it's a superior process like production or design, that's very difficult to copy. Intellectual property is where you protect the design of your products. Technology that enables you to predict customer needs better. And the resources, like the assets and capital and machinery and land. But it could also be access to natural resources like springs and mines. And there are a lot of different sourcing strategies an organisation can adopt. You can look for domestic only, international only if needed, international as part of your sourcing strategy, or global. But global sourcing is the process of sourcing goods and services from the international market across geopolitical boundaries. It aims to exploit global efficiencies such as lower skilled workers, cheaper raw materials, and other economic factors like tax breaks and lower trade tariffs. Some advantages of global sourcing are learning how to do business successfully in a new market, finding and developing alternative supply sources to reduce costs and stimulate competition. And the opportunity exists to locate scarce skills and resources not available or unprotected in their home territory. And that increases manufacturing capability or other technical capabilities. But there are disadvantages. Monitoring costs that go up and down, and there are hidden costs relating to the effort and time spent learning about different cultures and time zones, especially in the beginning. And there's exposure to financial, legal, and other risks that often is happening in emerging economies. So low-cost country sourcing is when a company sources materials from countries with lower labour and production costs in order to reduce their operating costs. The advantages and disadvantages are complex. Let's review of them. So the advantages is that you get affordable labour and raw materials, sometimes better quality products, lower infrastructure costs with good relationships with the government, and you've got the scalability of production, meaning that you can expand if you need to. But the downside, of course, is the distance and the location, and the fact that currencies are fluctuating. They have different laws and regulations. There's a risk to your intellectual property, which is where people will imitate your products, possibly unreliable suppliers and logistics issues, the risks with your inventory, and the communication challenges could be because of time zones or language barriers. So it is critical to select a supplier for a low-cost country sourcing effort that's going to maximise minimize challenges such as the political instability and transport cost, but maximize the potential for sustainable cost benefits. And through spend analysis, low to moderate spend categories that are not essential could be found, and this minimizes the likelihood of significant impact to a company's operation. But additionally, the ability to easily and quickly substitute goods from a domestic supplier is important, as this will help to reduce the sourcing risks significantly. Depending on the product or service to be sourced, or you could be going offshore, you might need to think about your intellectual property rights, because this could be a major concern and will play a critical role through the initiative. And as such, neither non-sensitive nor comprehensive proprietary goods should be considered for a fledgling low-cost country sourcing function, as global intellectual property protection schemes have not yet reached the standards set forth by developed nations. And lastly, preliminary research into foreign markets should be conducted to ensure that they are indeed competitive sources of international supply, which can be leveraged. There are a number of ways in which language and cultural barriers can be broken down, from combining culture with language to show respect. Remember, the barriers are two-way streets, so focus on clearly enunciating and slowing down your speech. Even if you're pressured for time, don't rush. If you're not 100% sure you've understood what the other person said, politely ask for clarification and check that both of you have understood what's been said and that the others have fully understood you. Watch for the three-letter abbreviations such as SCM and other organizational language that cannot be understood. Cross-cultural communication takes more time, if not all the time. Certainly, initially, you cannot expect your communication to occur with the same speed and ease as when you're communicating with someone in your own culture. So some of the cultural and social issues is that language presents a barrier when dealing with suppliers based in another country, and it can prove costly if you get into misunderstandings. Procurement professionals also need to research and understand the local cultures. That is the shared beliefs, values, and behaviours of a social group. It's essentially important to understand the differences in attitudes and values when negotiating. And with cultural differences that aren't accepted or understood, it can result in misunderstandings, loss of money, and loss of contracts. So therefore, view culture within the language. There can be cultural barriers even if both countries speak the same language in relation to the approaches of negotiation or level of formalities. Choose the location carefully. You need to find a country that the cost-effective labours are there, but also has linguistic compatibility with your own. Know and communicate your business goals. You need to ensure that the company you are outsourcing to understands your goals and that you're trying to achieve. And check and monitor those relationships. Communicate well. Telephone calls enable better flow of information, but emails provide a written record that can be tracked back to time and again. Improve your foreign language skills. Even learning a couple of key phrases that can help to build trust and break down barriers. Think and act with an open mind. Develop multicultural teams to deal with business issues in a global environment. Have patience. Many cultures across the world place emphasis on taking time to consider alternatives before taking action. And be respectful of cultural differences. Now, all employees are entitled to a contract of employment that forms the basis of the employment relationship. The Employment Rights Act requires employers to provide most employees with 2 calendar months of starting work with a written statement of the main terms of contract. The Health and Safety at Work Act lays down a wide range of duties on employers. Employers must protect the safety and health and welfare of the workers, as well as at work and on the premises. And the Equalities Act provides a legal framework to protect the rights of individuals and advance equality of opportunity for all. It provides Britain with a discriminatory law which protects individuals from unfair treatment and promotes a fair and more equitable society. Now, the World Trade Organization is an organization that sets the rules between the trade of nations. And the aim is to help producers of goods and services, exporters and importers to carry out their business. The World Trade Organization is the body to which government go in order to negotiate trade agreements, settle disputes and resolve trade problems. And then the International Labour Organization, the ILO. This is the United Nations agency dealing with labour problems, international labour standards, social protection and work opportunities for all. It was formed after World War I to improve living conditions and workers' rights. And the main aims are to promote rights of the work, to encourage employment opportunities, improve social protection by reducing poverty and vulnerability, and strengthen communication on work-related matters. So here you can see the International Labour Organization's core standards that should be implemented in any supply chain. It says you should have no forced labour, no discrimination, no child labour, no excessive hours. You need to pay a living wage. And the final one is freedom of association, which says that workers have the right to join a union. Now, labour standards and forced working practices are things that an organisation needs to consider, especially when they're carrying out activities. And the regulations and policies that govern labour standards do vary from country to country, and they depend on whether the country is developing or developed, the country's income per capita, and its political, social and cultural conditions. There are still many workers outside the scope of labour law who need protection from poor labour standards. And implementing ILO's core labour standards ensures that all workers get to work under a reasonable condition. So an organisation is responsible for taking steps to ensure that the risks of forced labour in its supply chains are minimised as far as possible. And businesses need to carry out a number of activities. So firstly, create a supply chain policy that covers the ILO's core labour standards. Ensure stakeholders recognise their commitments to their workers. Audit and report on issues to ensure compliance. Provide ongoing training to ensure labour standards are maintained, and sign up to certification schemes like Fair Trade. Now, the Modern Slavery Act applies to businesses in the UK with a turnover over a specific amount, which was initially set at £36 million. And these businesses are required to publish an annual slavery statement and human trafficking statement in a prominent place on their website. So human trafficking is the trade of humans for the purpose of forced labour, sexual slavery, or commercial sexual exploitation for the traffickers or others. Bonded labour. You've got debt bondage, which occurs when an individual is forced to work to repay a debt. As the workers labour to pay the debt, the employer can add other expenses, making the repayment impossible and enslavement permanent. Forced labour includes all types of enslavements that include and involve coercion against one's will and a threat of punishment. Any form of modern-day slavery that involves children under 18 is considered child labour. More than a quarter of slaves today are children, and many are involved in occupations that are harmful, both mentally or physically. And domestic slavery consists of live-in domestic workers who cannot leave of their own free will. And a good way to remember these is the humans being forced into continued duress. Now, a living wage is a human right. Living wages do more than keep people out of poverty, they help people to participate in social and cultural life. A living wage enables people to afford a basic lifestyle, which is considered acceptable by society as a whole. Social Security provides payments to eligible people for sickness, unemployment, and death of a partner or retirement. Now, profit is the money that a business makes after all its costs are subtracted. But decision makers in businesses are likely to be motivated by more than just profit. Discerning the motives that lead business people to make ethical decisions in economic contexts is important because it aids for morale evaluation for such decisions. But controversial economic theory has far too long assumed a self-centered model of motivation, to which may contrast an environmental view of ethical choices. The result is to see business decision-making as implying dilemmas. On the other hand, we argue, if one assumes multiple motives, economic and ethical, in ordinary business decisions, is a more fruitful model for ethical motivation. And multiple motives are assumed to be the norm in a world of large organizations with complex decisions and stakeholder management. On this basis, a two-step approach to morally evaluating mixed motives in business decisions is preferred. First, the fit of motives with substantial ethical values should be ascertained, and then the efficiency of moral movements and motives in yielding ethical behaviours and outcomes should be determined. Now, a business has three main kinds of stakeholders, and each of these have different needs. So you have your internal stakeholders, members of the organisation who operate within its boundaries. Connected stakeholders, where organisations that aren't inside your business, but they have activities and stakes within your business and some formal ties like contracts. So they're usually customers and suppliers and banks. And then the true externals is the wider stakeholder group that are less affected by your activities and results. And it's vital that in procurement know their business needs and understand the roles of the needs of their stakeholders. And this is Mendelow's stakeholder mapping matrix. With a matrix, you can begin to capture each stakeholder's relative importance and needs visually. Start by adding the names of the stakeholders into the matrix, whether you think they fit best. So, for example, the person outside of procurement who is interested in the project and whose opinion carries a lot of weight may fall into the manage closely quadrant, because they not also do they pose a risk of disruption by that person, even though they're not technically part of the team. Now, the steps for detailed analysis of stakeholders for undertaking a detailed analysis would start with listing the most important stakeholders and then categorising who they are. You know, have you got people like government, society, pressure groups, those that are for or against, the winners and unaffected, and the losers in relation to business activities. The third step is to determine their expectations and the benefits to them in the business activities. How will their interests conflict with your business goals? And then 4, give each stakeholder a score using the information from the first 3 steps and rate them on the variables such as their importance to the business, their influence over the business, level to which they're interested in your activities, and the amount of power they will have to force the business to act in a certain way, like the governments and regulatory bodies who have high power. And then finally, the legitimacy of their interest, because the business has a contract with a stakeholder or moral obligation to them. The 5th step is to identify power and influence among them stakeholders. Who has the power? Who depends on who? Who is influenced by who? And how are these stakeholders achieving their level of influence? And then the final step is to identify the stakeholder resources. Who has control over the resources and the information that you're going to need? Demand planning pertains to the process in which consumer demand is forecasted, and that enables the facility to have an accurate representation of how much products cost or how much to produce. This component can account for demand well into the future, with it even sometimes being able to forecast for up to a year. And while demand planning is usually associated with sales, it also correlates with supply planning, which ensures that an operation has the correct amount of supplies to meet demand. Overall, demand planning allows the facility to have a thorough understanding of how much products is needed within a given time. And demand management is similar to demand planning through attempting to keep supply and demand at the same level. But demand planning and management focuses on customer demand in the short run. Demand management oversees the current status of consumer demand and ensures that the facility will not experience any activity pertaining to loss of profit. Demand management is more capable than demand forecasting when it comes down to taking advantage of any current business opportunities. So let's look at the ways in which demand can be managed. Conducting ongoing forecasts, preparing responses to volatile events, involving all your stakeholders, and adjusting supply and executing plans in real time. Now, the need for urgent orders arises when a business holds no stock for a particular product, meaning the customer are demanding the product and the business cannot fulfill the demand. And if a business doesn't have the effective supply chain strategy, urgent orders may lead to potential conflict with stakeholders and the business supply chain. There are points in the supply chain where problems may arise and have an impact on the business cost. These points are called touch points, and let's review some of the top touch points that affect cost. So firstly, transport. When pallets are moving during transport, they need to be repositioned. Quality control. When lots of goods need to be unstacked for inspection because poor quality is suspected. And finally, the retail shop, where excess stock arrives, it must be stored somewhere. So orders management, that's the process of efficiently tackling and fulfilling sales orders. It includes the cycle of people, processes and supplies to create a positive customer experience. Procurement must cover a multitude of aspects when sourcing and managing the process. The order management process starts from when a customer places an order to keeping track of that order until it's fulfilled. Although this process seems straightforward, it's actually rather complex because it involves different departments and people to get a purchase order moved into sales and then delivered. There are opportunities for savings and can be more efficient for every company. Let's review. Customer service. So you've got the option here, do not offer service or offer more the work than is needed. What about your supply chain strategy? Be flexible and adaptable to a changing environment. With your sales and operation planning, involve sharing information and bringing people together across departments. With your network design, where do you hold stock to serve your customers? Balancing the cost of holding to acquiring stock, efficiency versus speed. Supply chain network performance, that's the cost relating to inventory, facility, transport and service. And then outsourcing, if they can do it better and cheaper than you. The use of assets should be used to the optimum level to be more productive with fewer assets. And performance measurements is to set up objectives and targets before choosing your KPIs. And finally, your KPIs, key performance indicators, need to be relevant and meaningful. Short-term commercial gains need to be considered against long-term availability of supplies. Procurement professionals must manage the contrast tension between the following 5 operations: quality, dependability, cost, flexibility and speed. So from a quality perspective, this is the ability to deliver products to agreed specifications that are error-free. Dependability is the ability to meet expectations of your customers by delivering products and services according to the promises made. Cost is the ability to produce products and deliver services at low cost. Flexibility, the ability to change your volumes and timescales or your product or service mix. And finally, speed, which looks at the ability to respond to customer demand, including short lead times. Now, cost reduction is often the main focus of procurement professionals seeking commercial gains in the short term. But decisions regarding cost must always be balanced with other operational performance objectives to ensure sustainability. And that's for the business to perform in the long term. So, for example, how dependable are market supplies of strategically important products and services? What risks could we be facing by buying from those supply chains? What if they fail? And supply chain forecasting can help us to weigh up the short-term gains against the long-term availability of supplies. And there are three types of supply chain forecasting: demand, supply, and price. Demand forecasting considers your organization's requirements. Supply considers factors that could affect supply, like trends. And price forecasting uses data on supply and demand to predict short-term and long-term prices. Supply chain management factors should be considered. So for a supply chain to remain competitive in the long term, the organization within which it works must collaboratively and cooperatively seek some benefits with their partners. Long-term equilibrium can be achieved when the organizations in the supply chain remain constant and are not changing. Thank you for watching.